I am very, very excited for this panel discussion today that's titled No More Strangers, Breaking Down Borders at BYU. And as a sociologist, this is something very dear to my heart. I think this is something that all of us on this campus should be thinking about, and is how we can come together as a BYU community. So we have a panel of faculty and experts who will be presenting to us, and they'll each present first, and then we'll open it up for questions and for discussion. So the first is Julie Valentine, who is an assistant professor in the College of Nursing and a forensic nurse. She researches sexual violence, interpersonal violence, and violence against women. And she was also on the BYU Advisory Council on campus response to sexual misconduct, which just took place this last fairly recently, and they've been able to advocate, to propose changes on campus that have been very helpful. Then we have Steve Smith, who is director of the Counseling and Career Center. He's a licensed psychologist and has worked at BYU for 26 years. And he also works with members of the LGBT community at BYU. And then we have Professor Ruiz Bybee, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Teacher Education, and he teaches courses in multicultural education. And he researches the role of identity and cultural knowledge in the educational experiences of students and pre-service teachers. Especially his focus has been with Latinos and in their transnational settings. So we really appreciate them coming and sharing their thoughts and expertise with us. And so we'll hear from each of them briefly and then open it up for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me for this presentation. I've been looking forward to this. I think it's exciting that we're having these discussions, correct? That we are, and I love the title, Breaking Down Borders. So I'm going to be talking today on breaking down borders at BYU. He said there was a delay. Let's see. Now, did I make it go off? There we go. Got it. I'm going to be talking specifically about breaking down borders when we think of gender. Now, I'm very aware that the definition of gender right now has changed, and Dr. Smith is going to be talking more about that. But I'm going to be specifically talking about gender when we look at male-female gender. This is an area where all my focus is regarding research and also my clinical practice. I'm a sexual assault nurse examiner, so I care for victims of sexual assault. They are my patients, so this is very near and dear to my heart. When we think of breaking down borders, when we think of refugees, and we link that with gender, I want to think for a minute about the definition of refugee. It's those that are fleeing, right? Those that have been persecuted, displaced. When you think of that as gender, we want to kind of wrap our mind around the thought that gender can also make people feel displaced, can also make people feel marginalized. And that's the goal, is to break that down so that we do not have that. There we go. I have to talk about violence, interpersonal and sexual violence. And I have to talk about that when we're looking at this issue of gender and feeling marginalized or feeling persecuted, because the scope is so broad. And we all need to understand this. Years ago, 15 years ago, when I started working in this area and really began to understand the number of people impacted by sexual and interpersonal violence, I thought, why is this not headlines every day? Right now it kind of is, right? We're in a trend with the Me Too movement, and we're hearing more about it. As researchers across the country, we have discussed that it first really started in the military. The military, there were victims that came together and said, we're going to speak out. and the military has done some phenomenal changes. Then it switched to campuses. Right now, it's government, it's Hollywood, it's big business where we're hearing more. Whose voice we are not hearing are those most marginalized. The single mom who is being sexually harassed at work but can't afford to say anything about it or fear she'll lose her job. So we have those somewhat empower more women coming forward, and that's continuing to grow. But when you look at the scope of the problem, the Utah numbers are 1 in 3 women will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime, 1 in 6 raped. This was a study done by Utah Commission on Criminal and Juvenile Justice. I don't have up there, but the FBI, we have uniform crime reports. The FBI numbers, Utah for violent crimes is a very safe state, except for one violent crime, and that's the crime of forcible rape, where we have been higher than the national average since 1991. And we have lower reporting rates than many states. So this is a significant problem that we need to address. 1 in 3 Utah women victim of domestic violence in their lifetime. Maybe I'm pointing this in the wrong place. There we go. And fabulous thing, we had the campus climate survey that came out this fall. And campus climate surveys really are able to get a snapshot of what's going on. So we kind of have an idea of what is in Utah nationally. The campus climate survey showed 6.5% of women and 1.2% of men experienced unwanted sexual contact in the last 12 months. I'm sure many of you have heard 1 in 5 college women sexually assaulted during their time at college. So our numbers can't really be comparable to that because it was asked about the last 12 months. We also have more information about sexual assault, sexual abuse. On the campus climate survey, it asked about experience of sexual abuse or sexual assault before coming to campus. 21% of women on our campus and 6% of men on the campus climate survey stated that they had or were a survivor of sexual abuse or assault before coming to campus. So why am I talking about this topic of domestic violence? Remember when I talked about refugees, that they're fleeing, they're persecuted after a form of trauma. Sexual assault and sexual abuse is a form of that trauma. Now we have this broad scope of sexual assault. On campuses, we call it sexual misconduct that ranges from everything from sexual harassment all the way through rape and domestic and interpersonal violence. All of those make people feel marginalized, are a form of persecution. On the campus climate survey, they also had the question about experiencing more harassment. So this is not broken down to male or female, but 63% of the respondents on the campus climate survey said that they had experienced or witnessed sexist remarks or jokes about women. But women aren't the only one that have experienced this. We have 48% of men. So when we talk about equality, we need to be very clear that that is equality. We are not saying that one gender or one sex is better than the other, but that we need to look at each other as equals. We also have inappropriate comments about their or someone else's body or appearance, 57%. Again, those comments make people feel marginalized, make people feel like they may not belong. Now I want to shift to talking about education for a minute. When we look at college enrollment, right now in the United States, 56% of students are female. There's more females enrolled in secondary education than there are males across the country. Now, this compares in 1972 when Title IX came out. Before Title IX, Nixon signed in 1972, it was actually legal for schools to discriminate based on gender. But after Title IX, it was no longer legal. In 1972, 36% of college students were female, so we've seen a huge growth. But then we also have to look at the pay gap, and this is definitely still a significant issue. We have more women going to college. Some of the reasonings behind the pay gap is many times women graduate in degrees that may not have the higher income that many males might pursue in college. In the United States, FT stands for full-time. Full-time females working earn 80% of males. In Utah, that's 70%, so we rank 50th. And these are females that work full-times. We rank 50th in the nation. For BYU, these numbers were gathered from a study that was done looking at those that had taken federal financial aid. They found that 10 years after enrolling in school, males' average earning was $83,000 plus, and females was $29,000. So significant pay gap. What we don't know fully here is on the hours working on this study. So when we look at how do we break down borders related to gender, we have to look at every level. It's individual level, it's institutional, and it's societal. We have to examine all those different factors, and we could spend weeks just looking at those factors or more. When we look at the individual, how we feel, how we can make a difference, this is one of my favorite quotes from To Kill a Mockingbird. Now, this felt a little wrong, but I actually changed the pronoun to a gender-neutral pronoun in here, but it fit better. Atticus Finch, you never really understand a person until you consider things from their point of view, until you climb into their skin and walk around in it. That's what we have to do to break down these borders, right? We need to get a better understanding of what each of us are experiencing in this life. Marty Liccardo is a friend, a colleague of mine in Salt Lake who does a lot of trainings. He likes to do, when he's in groups of males and females, he likes to say, so think about what you do to avoid sexual assault. Now, most of the males are like, but the females are like, oh, I do this, and I make sure. And the males are like, wow. It helps them to have a better understanding of that experience. Mosiah 27. This was King Mosiah setting out a decree about not persecuting those of the church, those with faith. But we can really look at this as scripture about not persecuting a specific group. He said that there should be equality among all men. We can add in and women. That every man and woman should esteem his neighbor as himself. I prefer the word esteem to respect. We have to have respect, but esteem is a level above that, right? Esteem means that you honor them as a child of God, that you respect them. And that's where we all need to move towards. And with that, I'm going to pass off to Steve, or Dr. Smith.
Let's see, got something coming up. There we go. those of you who have heard me speak before, I tend to like to start with a song, and so this will be no exception. This isn't an LGBTQ song because I don't know any of those, but it's a good psychologist song that tries to help you not be so hard on yourself. So you ready for this one? The slightest faults, the minorest flubs, each taste of human weakness, I whack myself with flaws like they're clubs and proof of my bleakness. For I believe that I must excel, relax, give slack, oh gee no. Each thing I do I must do well, or pop goes my ego. With appreciation to my colleague, Stephen Lars Nielsen. My call here today is to talk about kindness and understanding. Kindness and understanding, I believe, should be imbued in any Christian person, and certainly any member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Kindness and understanding will buy us a lot in this life, is my experience. Now, while my esteemed colleagues have done a lot of research in their particular areas, I must admit that my experience is not through research. It's through being in the office and through the wonderful opportunity to sit and work with my LGBTQ brothers and sisters. I appreciate their kindness and understanding toward me as I've tried to learn a little bit more about what it's like to be in their world. As a straight, cisgendered man, I've never been threatened, ever in my life, for my sexuality. As a straight, cisgendered man, I've never been made fun of, except I might have been called gay if somebody thought that I was being stupid. As a straight, cisgendered man, there are things that I've never had to experience in my life that my LGBTQ brothers and sisters have had to experience. And I, in the office and in other settings, have come to recognize that life is not easy if you are a gender or sexual minority. So my call is to understanding and kindness. We all know the mission statement of BYU. We would like all students to be spiritually strengthened, to be enlarged intellectually, to have their character built, and to have the foundation to have lifelong service and learning. That's pretty easy to say, but perhaps not so easy to do. And if you're struggling with other issues, that is harder, in fact, exponentially harder to do. Elder Rasband said in a talk in 2015 here at BYU, let fairness guide our treatment of others. Most important, we need you to engage in dialogue regarding the complexities of this issue, meaning the issue of LGBTQ, religious freedom, and find solutions of how to best extend fairness to everyone, including people of faith. These conversations need to be occurring in our schools, perhaps right here at Brigham Young University, in our homes, and in our relationships with friends and coworkers. I believe that those conversations are critical. Elder Oaks, there's not a change in the church's position of what's morally right, but what is changing and what needs to change is helping church members respond sensitively and thoughtfully when they encounter same-sex attraction in their own families and among other church members or elsewhere. Having that sensitivity is extraordinarily important. We need to help persons reduce feelings of isolation. President Worthen, no one can flourish in isolation. We need to increase the number and qualities of eternal relationships, seek out opportunities to develop positive relationships with others, and seek a positive and eternal relationship with God and Jesus Christ. Continuing, he said, everyone should be using their strength of mind and faith to learn as much as they can about the field and enterprise in which they're engaged, and look for opportunities to better share that information with others so their lives can be better. We should be doing that for our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, and we shouldn't be hesitant to do it at all, because they are, in fact, children of God, the same as us, and we should open our hearts and minds to them. Now, applying these principles at BYU, I believe, leads to dialogue, sensitivity, helping with the reduction of isolation, and learning and lifting or reaching out. Now, prevalence of concerns on campus. These are data from 2015. I am certain that our 2017 data that are in will reflect this, but these are the latest ones that I've calculated. About 10.5% of all clients presenting at counseling and psychological services reported some concern with sexual orientation. That is true nationally. What is perhaps most disturbing about working with LGBTQ persons in the counseling and psychological services is that we see higher rates of mental illness among those persons. Well, consider the situation. If you are an individual who believes that you are, by your very nature, flawed, and that you do not believe that you can have relationships with others ongoing, it makes sense that you are going to have more difficulty psychologically. For me, these data are disturbing, especially those that I have put in red. Those are data that talk about current suicidality, lifetime suicidal ideation, and self-harm. For those in the LGBTQ community, they are higher across the board. We also see that psychosocial variables of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters are also concerning and worrisome. Less family support, greater religious confusion, experience of greater discrimination, more general sexual concerns, and greater use of pornography. Now, these data reflect what is known nationally by several studies, and I'm not going to take a long time to go through all of these studies study by study, but we do see increased psychological distress, increased shame and guilt, spiritual, structural, and conflicting identities. And this conflict comes because of the tension between individuals' religious identities and sexual identities. Few spaces exist within religious frameworks for individuals to work these out. I believe that at BYU, we need to have this dialogue, and we need to have the space to be able to discuss how we can have, how these identities can come. I'm going to skip over this. A friend of mine, Dr. Caitlin Ryan, runs the Family Acceptance Project out of San Francisco State. And Dr. Ryan has done a great deal of research with LGBTQ persons who are in LDS families. Her research, her robust research, suggests that when families reject their children who come out as gay, lesbian, transgendered, bisexual, or other gender minority, that they are 8.4 times more likely to have reported a suicide attempt, 5 times more likely to report high levels of depression, 3.4 times more likely to use illegal drugs, and 3.4 times more likely to report to have engaged in unprotected sexual intercourse, which leads to sexually transmitted diseases, which leads, unfortunately, in many cases, to disability and death. Family acceptance helps protect against depression, suicidal behavior, and substance abuse, promotes self-esteem, social support, and overall health. And these data are very robust across many studies. I would suggest that the thing that needs to happen here at BYU is for us to learn to practice kindness and understanding. We need to be able to do that and have our LDS LGBTQ students feel that acceptance. As we do that, I believe that these risk factors that I've shown here will go down. It's very clear to me that the risk factors for mental health are related to the social isolation and the religious conflict that these individuals experience. We have the ability to help our LGBTQ students by refraining from rejection. We want dialogue, not judgment, sensitivity, not verbal harassment, reaching out, not exclusion, lifting and learning, and not showing outward disapproval. I'll end with this lovely statement from President Hunter. I would invite all members of the church to live with ever more attention to the life and example of the Lord Jesus Christ, especially the love and hope and compassion he displayed. I pray that we might treat each other with more kindness, more courtesy, more humility and patience and forgiveness. We do have high expectations of one another, and all can improve. Our world cries out for more disciplined living of the commandments of God. But the way we are to encourage that, as the Lord told the prophet Joseph Smith in the wintry depths of Liberty Jail, is by persuasion, by long-suffering, by gentleness and meekness, and by love unfeigned, without hypocrisy and without guile. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation to speak today. I don't have a PowerPoint. I just have some words that I prepared. But I want to say that it's truly a treat to be on this panel and share some of my thoughts on breaking down borders of race and ethnicity at BYU. I want to start out by describing an experience I had a little over 10 years ago in 2007. At that time, I was a recent graduate of BYU, and I was working as a bilingual public school teacher in New York and living in the Harlem neighborhood. One of my most indelible memories is of walking down a crowded 125th Street after a long and challenging day at my school. 125th Street, also named Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, is the main thoroughfare of Harlem and is a space that is literally overflowing with different elements of black culture. In front of historic buildings in the Apollo Theater, there were black nationalists displaying huge images of lynching in the South, guys hawking bootleg DVDs out of suitcases, ready to zip them up and run when the police showed up, loud music playing, and a lot of people bumping past each other. On this particular day, it was hot and humid, and I remember feeling annoyed with everything, all the sights, smells, and sounds, pleasant and otherwise, that were just kind of rolling over me. As I pushed my way through the crowd and reflected on the way that I was feeling, likely with a sour expression on my face, I suddenly realized that I was experiencing the kind of textbook culture shock that I had learned about here at the Kennedy Center, in this very room, in fact, prior to doing research in an indigenous community in Guatemala. I was amazed that I seemed to be experiencing culture shock in Harlem, USA, in a way that I never had in multiple experiences in rural Latin America. My discovery of culture in my new neighborhood helped me think about my classroom differently, influenced my decision to become a professor of multicultural education, and frames 3 principles about breaking down borders of race and ethnicity that I would like to share today. The first 2 principles I want to discuss are what I like to call being in BYU, but 2, not being of BYU. Now, what do I mean by being in BYU? In terms of growing in your understanding about race and ethnicity, it means taking full advantage of the resources that exist here to learn about a wide range of humans, including, most importantly, yourselves. As a new teacher in New York, I would not have had a framework for understanding my feelings of culture shock in a new racial environment without the training I received here in the Kennedy Center. Without frameworks to understand new kinds of reality, we become like the 2 young fish in David Foster Wallace's famous allegory, who, when an older fish asks us, "How's the water today?" swim for a bit and then ask each other, "What the hell is water?" I intentionally use the word training to describe being in BYU because in my field of multicultural education, is premised on the notion that learning to teach minoritized students in equitable and culturally responsive ways is a process that, not unlike Liam Neeson, involves gaining particular skills and dispositions over a long career. Many mistakenly perceive their own stereotypes and implicit biases as evidence of a personal moral failing, rather than as indicators of the large, unjust systems that we all move through. The reality is that learning to see these systems and the rich dimensions of human experiences takes time and work, and there are many people and places on this campus that can help you develop those frameworks. In the US, it is common to think of race and ethnicity in terms of a black-white binary, but here at BYU, we are fortunate to have classes and area studies programs that focus on the African diaspora, Black and Mexican American history in the US, the experiences of Asians, Pacific Islanders, and Middle Eastern individuals, and many other topics. In addition to the formal academic programs, we have a range of performing arts groups and clubs like the Black Student Union, Women of Color Club, the Tribe of Many Feathers, Latino Club, and many others. As you seek out these spaces and get to know the people in them, I encourage you to practice a sense of openness, humility, and meekness. Elder Neely Maxwell described meekness as speaking up without speaking down. And I think meekness becomes even more important for our return missionary students who have unique but ultimately incomplete kinds of knowledge about a region or cultural group. To put it bluntly, just because you have spent some time where someone is from or developed proficiency in their language, it does not mean that you know what it is like to move through the world in their body, as Atticus Finch pointed out, right? Also, be sure not to treat folks as exotic objects, and be sure to listen more than you speak. This principle applies to return missionaries and research professors alike. You will be richly rewarded in your life as you seek to be in BYU and develop these skills and dispositions with a sense of intellectual humility. The second thing that should be apparent about my experience as a new teacher in Harlem is that it could not have happened here on the BYU campus. This is part of what I mean by the second principle I wanted to discuss, which is not being of BYU. This principle might strike some as odd in that in the scriptural admonition to be in the world but not of the world is sometimes framed as a bad place. We often forget the broader theological story that the world is not simply bad, but unfinished and incomplete. It is in this light that I would like you to consider the ways that BYU, for all the wonderful things that it offers, is one, incomplete, and two, not actually real. Here on campus, we acknowledge the incompleteness of BYU and the non-badness of the world implicitly with phrases like the world is our campus, but fail to consider the full implications of this incompleteness of the university and traditional university experiences. For me, it meant that although I had learned about culture shock and the historical and cultural experiences of Black Americans, I did not really start to understand the full implications of that knowledge until I was walking through Harlem on a hot and humid, but also bright and wonderful August day. In much the same way, the knowledge that you gain in these spaces will be incomplete until you apply it outside the university in meaningful ways. I think part of this is taking advantage of the experiential, inspiring learning opportunities that I mentioned earlier, but there's a deeper, more personal level to this as well. We simply cannot say that we love the history or art or music of Latinos, Asians, or African Americans, or anyone, without also knowing and loving the humans who created that history, art, and music. This is the walk principle, the difference between learning about something and trying to live it. In my class, we call this the notion that everyone believes in the abstract notion of equity and fairness and social justice until they actually have to do something or give up something. We must actually seek to have meaningful relationships across racial and ethnic boundaries to remedy this incompleteness. The second way that I want to encourage you to not be of BYU is to remember that BYU is not actually real. By referring to BYU as not actually real, I do not make reference to the BYU as a bubble trope that folks often repeat. As a Latino who grew up in a working-class Mexican-American community in rural Central California, I sometimes heard this bubble description of BYU, and I was indeed surprised at the sheer number of white people on campus as a freshman student. What I did not understand then was the ways that the school and community spaces I had moved through, including BYU, were and continue to be influenced by the pervasive racial, ethnic, and economic segregation of American life. Although Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 ended de jure segregation in public schools, the reality is that de facto segregation reached its low point in the late 1980s, and that many of our schools and communities have been resegregating since then. This segregation continues in higher education as colleges and universities, including BYU, emphasize standardized tests like the ACT that tend to favor white and Asian American students from higher income families. Last year, a team led by researchers from Stanford, Brown, and Harvard ranked nearly all the colleges in the US in terms of how well they do in providing access and college success for low-income students. BYU ranked 2,125th out of 2,137 institutions. According to Michael Hansen, of Brown and Brookings Institution, quote, BYU's access rate for low-income students is lower than 99% of all colleges nationally. Less than 2% of students come from households with incomes in the bottom 20%. It has a lower access rate than most institutions typically considered elite, including Stanford, Duke, and 7 out of 8 Ivy League colleges, including Harvard and Yale. Clearly, some of the principal barriers we need to overcome are those that exist for low-income students of color to be here at BYU in the first place. The last principle I want to talk about is resisting racial innocence. When you really listen to students of color talk about their experiences at BYU, either in person or through some wonderful recent YouTube videos that some have created, what emerges is a sense of isolation amongst our broader student population that is generally nice, but has little understanding of what they experience here. This lack of understanding is due, in part, to the distorted reality created by the segregation of our lives and schooling experiences. But I want to emphasize that this lack of understanding is not benign. Dr. Martin Luther King captured this principle in his letter from a Birmingham jail when, speaking of lukewarm white allies, he stated, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will." The shallow understanding is at the heart of the racial innocence that the great Black American writer James Baldwin wrote about in a letter to his nephew in 1962 and published in his extraordinary book, The Fire Next Time. He characterizes his innocence as things about race that his country and countrymen do not know and do not want to know, and encouraged resistance, saying that if the word integration means anything, it means that with love we will force our brothers to see themselves as they are and to cease fleeing reality and to change it. There are many ways that we can resist racial innocence. Institutionally, I think this means not simply celebrating the latest increase in our U.S. News ranking, but also discussing more uncomfortable metrics and the ways that higher education systems perpetuate inequality and distort our reality. On a personal level, we can take full advantage of the opportunities to be fully in BYU while accepting that the things that we learn in university spaces are also not enough. This year on June 8th is the 40th anniversary of the end of the church's ban on priesthood ordination and temple participation by Black people. This is an excellent opportunity to raise our consciousness about the experiences of our Black brothers and sisters at BYU and within the church. I encourage you to visit the website shouldertothewheel.org and take one of the pledges there to do things like reread Official Declaration 2, read the Race and the Priesthood essay, speak to people about the impact of the ban on their families, and reflect why, as recent as last year, the church has had to release statements condemning, quote, church members who promote or pursue a white culture or white supremacy agenda. I've spoken about the ways that BYU is incomplete, but if there's one thing that I want you to take away from my talk, it's about the ways that we are also personally incomplete if we don't understand the experiences of people of color or of women or LGBTQ individuals and other minoritized groups in our campus community.